Congratulations on making it thus far. Good luck for the round.
Thank you. With that, just a quick reminder, just to refer to the panel as a whole. In terms of ground rules, first, in terms of timekeeping, I'll put timestamps in the chat at 1, 7, 8, and 8:15, but I might miss a few, so please time yourselves, time your opponents, and ask few eyes on time. Second, in regards to introductions, introduce yourself at the start of your speech, share a name, your preferred pronouns if you wish to do so, and your POI preferences. I'll try to keep a track of that. The motion set for the semifinals is this house regrets the use of identity-based self-deprecating humor by minority entertainers in popular culture. I welcome the Prime Minister to start the debate. Here.
Okay, hi. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, perfect. Okay, give me a second just to set up. All right. Ready? I'm going to start my timer in 3, 2, 1. The collective sum of minority experiences cannot be summed up to over the span of a joke. A Black person's childhood cannot be summed up in getting pulled over by a cop and living the life in the hood. And an Asian person's life cannot be summed up to just being good at math or getting made fun of for their small eyes. Because we cannot sum up a gay person's life just because they're very weird or act a specific way. That's why we're so very proud to propose a few things in this speech. 1, let's first start with some framing. I would first like to talk about the incentives of comedians. Comedians want to get the most audiences. It's not just because they want money. Well, that might be a very important reason. Comedians want, let's say, people to have money and invest money into them because that's their jobs, their livelihoods, and that's how they make a living. But they also have an obligation to contracts, to companies and agencies that sign them. They have an obligation to get a specific amount of audiences or a specific amount of views for their shows, etc. Number 2 is that these comedians are also likely to use social media. I told you before that they have the incentive to try and reach the most people as possible. And another good way for them to do that is through social media. We already see this in the status quo. When comedians go out of their way to post certain clips of their comedy shows on their own Instagram to try and get a bigger following and view. Now, this is also detrimental in a few ways. Let me first start with characterizing a person. We're not a homogenous pact. We're born as dignified individuals, which means we have our own experiences, our own knowledge, and our own ideologies and morals. And it's wrong to interpret every single person to be a specific homogenous pact or the same or exactly the same or have the same thoughts, etc. Now, let's go into my first point about how on their side, opposition trivializes the experiences of minorities and takes away what's important. A few things. 1, there are 2 types of comedians. There's one that does a lot of comedy for awareness, and then the type that does comedy just for cheap laughs. Let's first start with the cheap laughs. That's straight up respectful. No, thank you. I think making cheap laughs or making some type of joke about certain struggles you have as a minority is not just disrespectful to yourself, but also the rest of your minority and fellow communities as a whole. Number 2, though, is the one that opposition is probably going to try and characterize best: awareness. Here's a few issues with this. People don't walk into a comedy show expecting an entire political essay on the struggles and economic discriminations of systematic discriminations within Indigenous groups and minorities. They probably walked into that comedy show to expect to have a laugh, to have a lightheartedness. So a lot of the jokes that these comedians make are probably not going to go through. A lot of the jokes about having weird childhood experiences as an Indigenous person or an Asian person is probably not going to be fully interpreted because, again, we are not a homogenous pact, but dignified individuals. Another thing is because, no thank you, these comedians have an incentive to reach the most people. And I feel like when they go too niche with their jokes, it becomes hard, unpalatable, and hard to relate. I don't think a white person can relate with the weird cultural differences you have as an Asian person or as a very specific, special type of minority. As a result, these people are likely going to make their cases more palatable by trivializing these experiences or making it just a little less insane or not as bad as they think it is. This is problematic for a few reasons. 1, it takes away a lot of the accountability measures and also why people think certain things are bad. It takes away the experiences and the trauma and also stories that are important to these minorities. And 2, Wrong interpretations are common. When things become trivialized, when things become simplified, people are bound to make interpretations. And it's not because they're trying to villainize these people, but I think people as a whole are just trying to understand certain context and content they get on a daily basis. As a result, they will probably try to make some type of interpretation to have a better understanding, and oftentimes it's wrong because these people don't have the same experiences. It also leads to further romanticization. For example, these types of interpretation can romanticize the wrong things. This looks like a Black person romanticizing hood life or life in the gang or in a bad community. Although Black people have gotten there through systematic discrimination and also lack of opportunities over time, it's wrong for these people to keep romanticizing how being in a gang is good and focusing on the opportunities and experiences to be part of one instead of trying to uplift millions of these individuals from the oppressive and lack of opportunities and places. That's why it's wrong, like generally wrong to romanticize things. And number two is even if things are not romanticized, they're going to be stereotyped. People are going to group you into a certain type of way. When you hear comedians trying to stereotypes, no thank you, of Asian people acting a certain type of way, or how our eyes are smaller, or how we constantly get homework. This is when you get certain stereotypes. And this is when people associate an entire group and community with just one specific action or stereotype. Before I go on, I'll take your point.
So what exactly will these minority comedians use now that their main way of engaging with the audience is removed on your side of the house?
I think minorities are funny. Like, I think the way comedians become comedians is that they already have a passion or a talent for comedy. And there's a lot of types of comedies that isn't just about making fun of their own personality or individual. And also, a lot of minorities have to live in places where they aren't fully represented, where they are the minority for a very specific reason due to discrimination or just not enough of that population. So they already built a lot of abilities to be funny, to try and fit in more socially, or to compensate because they aren't fitting into the entire society or narrative as a whole. So I feel like on our side, or on either side of the house, comedians are already funny. That's how they have their jobs. That's how they have their contracts. And I don't think that's going to change. I think when opposition tries to push that you need a certain type of comedian or a certain type of narrative to make yourself funny by deprecating your own self, that's when people expect it. But on our side, when people don't do this, when people don't make their own self-deprecating jokes, you have less of an expectation for that. You have more room for creativity, for more room to make sure that you focus on comedy that's actually creative and actually inspirational and different versus what's happening in the status quo. Number two is my point on misrepresentation. There are minorities within minorities. For example, a Black person is a minority, but a woman is also a minority, which means a Black woman is a bigger minority within a minority, and they all have different experiences because we're not just a homogenous pact, but dignified individuals. Now, this is bad because when the comedians try and take stereotypes, and again, there are reasons that they use stereotypes to be more palatable, to be more relatable, and also because the bigger audiences will understand these stereotypes a lot better than just general ideas and specific niche narratives and jokes. So when these stereotypes are used on a regular basis, it alienates the other half of these minorities. It alienates smaller minorities within them, and it also groups them into a block, making people think that these minorities are just one homogenous pack instead of special and specific people who might need specific accommodation and help. You can be Asian, you can be Black, but you can also be a part of the LGBTQ community. You can also be a part of smaller minorities within, and this strips away a lot of their ability to get further representation, making stereotypes such as Asian kids are good at math, or forcing these stereotypes are detrimental, not just for the people who watch these comedy shows, but also for the people who accidentally consume it, like children who are easily impressionable and feel like they have to fit a certain narrative. And they're probably going to fit these narratives because these things are propagated all across social media. It also takes away a lot of the progressive movements and social ideas. For example, ideals of women trying to be more progressive, or how they can just be as equal as men in the workplace. When the comedians try and make jokes about women not being understanding or do not understand certain types of math problems, this takes away the narrative we once had and the progression that social movements work towards. Very proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech, welcoming Leader of Opposition.
Verbal POIs. proposition tells the poor college student trying to go on a talk show and tell individuals about their own experiences using self-depreciating humor that your self-experiences were never representative enough of your own struggles, that you were never representative enough of your own community, and all of your experiences then should be delegitimized and you should never talk about it anymore. We believe that stripping away the dignity of one minority entertainer is stripping away the identity of an entire community. There's 3 things in case setup before I'd like to move on to my responses. Firstly, what is the world on proposition? You have to regret the use of identity-based self-depreciating humor. This probably means like things when the Black community relates back to high crime rates within their neighborhoods, or how Trevor Noah talks about his experiences as being a mixed child. But what leads to then under Dias of the House is 2 things, because it never properly illustrated to you what are the forms of inspirational and creativity that you're able to have, right? We think that 1, it probably means that you force them to talk about their experiences in a sobering manner. But 2, you force them to talk about general things that are neutral, like how their day went and something funny that happened through it. This means that you homogenize all of their experiences to the experiences of the average Joe out there when you don't allow them to talk about their identity in a way that they prefer. But second, is that in the world in opposition, we don't regret the use of identity-based self-depreciating humor. We support status quo, where there are a multitude of ways in which different comedians use to express themselves. This already acts as a countervailing force to all of their harmful impacts on how you're unable to be empowering or how you're unable to spark creativity then. Thirdly, what is the burden on both sides? 1, proposition needs to prove why the minority identity is going to be better represented and what alternatives do they actually have through illustrations, not just a broad comment that it will be more inspiring. But 2, is that opposition needs to prove why it is uniquely a tool in a toolbox for minority entertainers to highlight their experiences. There's one big response I would like to give to the entirety of their case, because their entire case lies on this one line that it will homogenize the experiences of these individuals within the community, within the minority group. I think this is exactly why you should have self-depreciating humor, because comedies is about personal experiences that different people have. So this means that when you allow a Black woman and a Black man from the same community, but they have different experiences, to enter and talk about the nuances and the little cases that they face in their daily lives, this is probably when you have more perspective and you don't homogenize stereotypes of what you do in characters, for example, in Hollywood. It was uniquely through comedy which prioritizes personal experiences that allows this then. 2 arguments. Firstly, why the use of self-depreciating humor is inherently justified. There's 2 things under this. Firstly, is that the problem here is that self-depreciating humor is often taken up by minority comedians for 2 reasons. 1 is that comedies are often about the personal experiences of entertainers, like the use of satire when you talk about their experiences living in a high crime rate neighborhood. This means that all of the experiences, even if it might be stereotypical, it was the very true experiences that these people did go through. Like, they did got pulled up by a cop, and these are the very things that a majority of the people do feel within the community itself, and therefore these entertainers do so as well. But 2 is that it's often a form of escapism for these individuals when you're able to look back 30 years in time to realize that these were actually the things that really happened to me, but I have no medium in which I can express it, because as a comedian, I express it through comedy. I express it through making it something funny in order for me to bring out my own story. All of these things are legitimate forms in which people experience these things, and therefore they express it through that. But second thing here is, what is the impact? There's 2 things. Is that 1, the reason why pop culture is a medium for a lot of minorities to talk about their experiences is because why entertainment is often just about entertainment. These entertainers are there to be themselves and talk about their own experiences. This means that it is only legitimate under us of the house when we have pop culture as a medium that it accepts all individuals within the community with different identity, that you allow them to speak up about these things. But 2, it is always a legitimate tool for minority entertainers to talk about their experiences in whatever form that they want. Because the use of humor is when they don't allow these individuals to use humor to talk about their personal experiences that might be stereotypical, is one where you take away the dignity of these individuals then. You have no case. But I also like to note that given that accountability measures does exist, is that the majority of the people who watches these comedies, they are produced by minority comedians, are probably these minority groups themselves. This means that if it was something that was factually untrue or unrepresentative, we think that all of these things can still be corrected through things like cancel culture and discourse that individuals have after watching these comedies to begin with. Before I move on, I'll take that point.
Is it that comedians will talk about their unique experiences, or is it that comedians will relate to a wide variety of people? Which is it?
I think that minority comedians can have different ways of expressing themselves. We're saying that using self-depreciating humor is justified if that entertainer chooses to do so. You're the side that limits their options on how they're able to express themselves creatively. Second argument then is why self-depreciating humor taps into a bigger platform to voice out the minority experience. I think we directly clash them here in terms of how we're able to get better representation of the individuals within the community. Two things is that one, it is often a communal interconnectedness for these minority consumers when they watch things like self-depreciating humor, right? Because oftentimes comedy is a safe space for minorities where you humanize their experiences. This is why we satirize our own struggles when we feel too sad about it, because we're able to tell individuals that this is probably how we feel, but we don't have to expose everything out there and let people see all of your wounds to begin with. This is important for two reasons. One, it is empowering towards the people who do relate to these experiences to begin with. It gives them some form of liberation. It is meaningful for you to see someone from your community that is successful despite going through the exact same things that you go through, even if it is something that's not so widely accepted to everyone in the community group. We believe that it is better than nothing. Some form of liberation is important under us of the house so that people can relate to it. The impact here is that the minority experiences is actually about them, so therefore we let them decide on what is acceptable and what isn't, and we let them lead the discourse at the end of the day. We use comedy as a way in which people are able to speak up then. But the second thing is those are the majority consumers that watch these things to begin with. We believe that comedy is oftentimes the most accessible way for majority consumers to break their social bubble. The cis white male has no incentive to care about the experiences of minorities in their lives. It is when the biggest individuals out there, when they make self-depreciating humor and it is popular and widely accepted by the individuals in society, then it goes viral on TikTok and it goes viral on Instagram, that a cis white male is able to look at all of these things as entertainment. But this is important because all of these jokes that these individuals make, like self-depreciating humor, underlie their suffering and their experiences through things like satirization of these experiences to make it humorous. This is important because this is the only way in which discourse are ever able to reach the individuals outside of the community to fix the wrongs of the communal stereotypes that these individuals have on these people. It is when you have different experiences that were nuanced to the different identities of individuals that you're able to break through the stereotype that people have then. Proud to oppose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for that speech. Welcoming Deputy Prime Minister.
All right, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. I will take POIs in chat, please. It's only been 8 minutes, and side opposition already has a major contradiction within their case, because they tell us that these comedians are able to talk about their authentic experiences, that they are going to be just simply unique to this one person. But at the same time, they also somehow expect this comedian to connect to a wide audience and gain a major platform in order to create a safe space. That's not going to cut it for side opposition. They needed to have a much more nuanced case and actually analyze and solve the tensions that we pointed out right from first. On the other hand, the second thing I would like to note is on our side, we can also talk about minority experiences, just not self-deprecating ones. We can talk about minority experiences that bring people together, that are positive. And in side proposition, I am proud to stand for that case that we stand on. 3 things on today's agenda. Firstly, I want to talk about minority representation. Secondly, I want to talk about which platform is better. And thirdly, a last bit of substantive on toxic competition and what that leads to worse intersectionality on their side of the house. Firstly, on minority representation, their argument is that comedians need to self-deprecate themselves in order to be successful and relate to an audience. But I would note that in a world on our side where comedians no longer self-deprecate themselves, there wouldn't be an expectation for comedians to do so in the first place, which means that without this expectation, comedians are likely going to still be successful on our side of the house. But secondly, I would just note that there are so many other aspects of pop culture to make jokes about, right? Like Taylor Swift, Donald Trump, cute cat videos, right? I think it's unfair to say that without these self-deprecating
Point.
jokes, that somehow minority comedians, POIs in chat, are somehow just going to be completely gone on our side of the house. But rather, I think we're able to flip this. Why? On their side, comedians have built their base on one type of joke. They've basically become one-trick ponies entirely dependent on this one type of joke. On our side, because there is no more expectation for comedians to make self-deprecating jokes, it means comedians on our side have so much more flexibility to comment on a wide variety of issues in society. Not only is it significantly more interesting, this also is just more variety, which means it's much more interesting to audiences. We think comedians are still likely going to be very much successful on our side of the house. All right. Before I go on, I'll take the POI.
If the inspiration behind a black comedian's comedy was the experience where they were bullied in school because they were black, do you think that it is legitimate for you to say that this is not your experience and you shouldn't talk about it?
I'm not saying it's not the comedian's experience. I'm saying it's not representative of the millions of minorities that comedian claims to represent. And I'll talk about minority experiences right now. So their argument is to say that comedians create safe spaces for minorities to speak about their experiences. Two responses to this. Firstly, as we pointed out straight from first, comedians don't accurately represent their experiences. And there's a wide variety of reasons as to why this is the case. Firstly, they need to appeal to a wide audience. But secondly, note the white managers who control the program, the massive amounts of media pressure on these comedians to fit expectations and stereotypes. Ultimately, the comedian is not in control of his or own program. It's the people in charge. It's the bosses with the money. And unfortunately, in status quo that's run by basically white CEOs who have complete control over decision-making with absolutely no idea about how minority experiences work. But secondly, even if it was the case that minorities were accurately represented, now on their side, the benefit is still unclear. Why? Because now minorities feel obliged to self-deprecate themselves in order to access these safe spaces in the first place. And if the trade-off that they have on their side is that minorities need to self-deprecate themselves, well, then we don't think that's a good idea. As we explain, what does Claudia tell you on this? Firstly, she tells you that this forwards a perception that somehow your minority identity is negative. This incites teens to self-internalize this narrative and view their identity as negative and force themselves to self-deprecate themselves. But secondly, it causes things like bullying at school, where people will use these jokes and direct them at the minorities that they see in class. Absolutely no response we heard from LO. But secondly, as to why authentic experiences are going to be misrepresented, I think there's a variety of other reasons as well, right? Firstly, just the wide variety, just the incredible number of minority experiences out there, but also just due to a lack of time in the show, a lack of understanding from the comedian, but also just the need to appeal to the majority perception of minorities. Ultimately, the impact is huge. The harm on side opposition is that minorities feel they don't live up to these stereotypes, that somehow if you didn't have a tiger mom, that you're not Chinese anymore. That is the harm that we're dealing with on side opposition. They fail to address that completely in their previous speech. All right, on to the second argument that Claudia provides to you. And the reason why I spend less time on this is due to the lack of engagement that we heard from their side. What Claudia explains to you is that this trivializes the issue. It creates the perception that discrimination is trivial enough to be joked about. What does this mean? It means productive discourse is significantly more difficult on their side of the house, because to the point at which people cannot even differentiate between serious and humorous discussions, to the point at which people think discrimination is something that can be joked about, I think what you're ultimately doing is you're making you're trivializing a serious issue. I think this ultimately causes a narrative where people don't believe that discrimination is important enough to minorities to actually be talked about. I think you significantly reduce the ability of social movements to actually actually enact change and to actually forward an impact in these areas. Now onto the last argument for side proposition on toxic competition. The premise of this argument is that the lure of self-deprecating jokes is that it makes you feel special for who you are, that you have certain attributes about yourself that other people do not have. But this then becomes problematic, and it's undermined when other minority comedians also say how unique or rare or extreme their experiences are. This is problematic because it creates a race to the bottom, where in order for minority comedians to compete, they become increasingly radical and extreme in their statements in order to make themselves seem like the most unique, character, in order to make their distinct identity as more distinct than any other identity out there. I think this leads to two distinct impacts that they fail to address on their side. Firstly, this causes division among different minority groups, where minority groups feel even more isolated and powerless against the majority. Why? Because now they're unable to consolidate together on their shared experiences. Instead, they simply focus on a race to the bottom, where they simply compare, who had it worse, basically. Which minority experience was worse, which minority experiences is more stereotypical, which minority experience is more unique. But secondly, I also think this leads to a toxic view of other minorities, where you see them as worse than your own, where you see your own minority identity as like the best out there because of the stereotypes perpetuated by minority comedians. Because ultimately, as I already outlined, minority comedians have a direct incentive to try to differentiate themselves against other minorities, and that often leads to toxic competition, where minorities are unable to actually consolidate their experiences and actually create change, and instead they're too busy fighting against each other, too busy comparing who had it worse, too busy comparing the value of their identities against another's. And that is incredibly harmful. At the end of the day, I think I'm able to prove to you why comedians cannot possibly represent all the minority experiences out there, because ultimately, the minority experience is not and cannot be made into a joke. Proud to propose.
Thank you, DPM, for that speech welcoming DLO.
Okay. Starting speech. POI's true voice. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. The glaring flaw of the side of proposition was that they never had a positive comparative to begin with. They tell you in a one-liner in the POI response that actually minorities can be funny as well, and that's why they will still continue to have a job in the entertainment sector on their side of the house. This doesn't contend with the layers of nuances we gave you from first speaker on why these oftentimes are the unique experiences that require these minority these minority comedians to rise up in popular culture, and that's the reason why in the end of the day we give them more representation. This will be argued later further in my classes. 4 things here. Firstly, on awareness, secondly, on trivialization, and 2 things later on my extensions on why we are detabooing the whole idea on how minorities have experiences as well, and how self-deprecating humor is the only way for minority artists to get a footing in the industry. First issue then on awareness. This was their main content with all of the crux of our case coming from the first speaker. They tell you that awareness on our side isn't effective insofar there is enough grounds to regret this. Awareness isn't effective insofar as that people don't relate to these things to begin with. They tell you that first of all, when people go to entertainment shows or comedy shows, people don't expect political essays, and that's the reason why even if they get awareness through these mediums, they won't necessarily understand that information. And secondly, that niche jokes from minority artists are not relatable by the majority, and that's the reason as to why we don't get the awareness that we want. Here's a few responses. Firstly, on how people on our side of the house do not expect political essays, and that's why awareness is not going to be something that is effective. Yes, that's exactly our point.
these types of entertainment are not political essays. They are ways in which that information is being propagated that is going to be palatable to the public, that is humorous for people to understand and laugh at. And that's the reason why that information is likely going to stay longer in your brain, because it is something that you believe is funny. We told you that we get more platforming, and this is the most accessible form of spreading political information, exclusively because it wasn't the political essays that we rely upon within the status quo. And that means if people find the jokes funny, they subconsciously remember them when they go home. They bring them up in the next family dinner when they try to think about a topic to talk about. We exclusively humanize these minorities as people that also go through experiences as well, that are suffering from the power structures within the public. And that's the reason why these types of awareness is incredibly important, insofar as the most acceptable way for people to accept them on our side of the house. If anything, panel, we think their comparative was one where they had to defend the political essays as forms of awareness, where they are going to have people that cannot digest these types of information because they are inherently apathetic to them, and that's because their comparative wasn't enough to outweigh ours. All of their case thus far was them trying to defend trying to attack our negative case, but insofar as they do not have a positive comparative of how they increase awareness on their side of the house, they have to adapt to the long infographics and the articles that nobody reads. Therefore, no accessibility happens on their side, and therefore less awareness occurs. Second thing, on the niche jokes and how people will not relate to these things, therefore they won't find them funny. Two main things here. Firstly, I don't think you have to relate to jokes for them to be funny, right? You can watch Trevor Noah and his jokes about his experience as a minority, but you can still be funny because it's objectively funny as an experience. For example, a parallel here in Intuition Pump, if a friend tells me a joke about his personal experience on his day to work today, I don't have to be my friend to find that experience funny. I can be, from my own perspective, find that experience funny because it is something that's objectively funny to begin with. That's because on our side of the house, the majority can now find these types of things as something that is accessible for them in of itself, and the minorities can now also have a way in which they can find comfort within these like minority entertainments. That's the reason why these niche jokes is going to give a sense of comfort, and this will engage with all these segregation points they have in the previous speaker on how the majority would not relate to the minority at all. They have to relate, they just need to find them funny, and that platforming is exclusively why our side is better. But secondly, this doesn't engage completely with how, since first speaker, we give you multiple reasons as to why these types of jokes provide the communities of minority groups a safe space to ensure that you're able to have someone who relates to you, to realize that you're not alone in this world, and it's something that's exclusively liberating to the vulnerable individuals insofar as they do not have any other alternative, because otherwise it's tabooed in society and they cannot speak out against those issues. But in these very platforms, we provide these entertainments is the reason why we win today's debate. Before I move on to the second issue, though, I'll take a few one.
Even if people are more engaged with their funny political messaging, what is your funny political messaging? Your political messaging is literally telling minorities that they are worse than other races simply because of their identity.
No, understand that you will not be going up on stage trying to ruin your entire self-image and completely deplatforming your entire minority group. You are calling out the problems within society that made your group like this to begin with. When you say that when I go to school and I got spat on, that's not because you as a minority is worse as an individual. It's because there are multiple other racist people in this world that do not recognize you as a human, and that's the problem in which we platform onto these large groups. We do not completely ruin their self-image. We are calling out the power structures in which that made them like this to begin with, and that's the exclusive awareness that we have on our side of the house. Second quick thing on trivialization and how they claim that we do not engage. We tell you firstly, that on their side of the house, if they wanted to claim that people will romanticize the minority experience, that completely contradicts everything they tell you about how people will not relate to the minority experience. If they want to tell you that people will not relate, then you won't romanticize it because you don't find it interesting. You cannot run both things at once on their side of the house. But we believe there are also other avenues which you can combat certain stereotypes within like these trivializing the minority experience, right? There are completely like, let's say a joke really becomes that bad in which it completely is ignorant to the minority experience. There are people that call out these sorts of things on social media, and there's also progressive movements that opt for these types of minority aid in the first place. Our side is a tool in the toolbox that ensures that people get that type of platforming, and that's why on our side we have trivialization is something that has a countervailing force against it. Lastly, then, on how self-deprecating humor is often the key for minority artists to stand out in a sea of privileged entertainers from the majority. What's the problem on the side of proposition? We think the cornerstone of entertainment is to relate your content to your personal experiences. If the minorities now do not self-deprecating humor, their only alternative on the side of prop is to make majority-centered jokes. Note, this takes their alternative at best. In a PR response from PM, they tried to sound smart by saying that, well, minorities are funny. I'm sure they can make jokes that fit in with the majority experience. Let's take a step back, panel, and digest that. They want the Black comedians to whitewash themselves to make jokes that are palatable to their audience. They want them to lose their complete identity, to stop satirizing their to fit in and to make them funny and relatable to the majority. If anything, they were the ones that were oppressive to the minority entertainments, and they were the ones that ruined their safe space. Why was this problematic? Firstly, like intuitively, it's a complete erasure of their identity. It takes away their artistic expression and their ability to speak out against power structures. But secondly, there's also no appeal for them to outcompete majority entertainers. If a Black comedian and a white comedian were not expected to joke about the white experience, obviously the white comedian will be funnier because they're the most proximate and real world experience, that a real world person that can discharge these jokes more effectively. Our paradigm was one that gives them the unique appeal to stand out in this entertainment sector because it gives them a unique distinction from the majority, the one that's fresh and new, therefore finally giving them a footing in society. And this is important because minority comedians need this mechanism to reverse the effects of power structures that previously oppressed them. They can now turn these negative experiences to the selling point that provides them a successful life. If anything, this is our reciprocal duty that we have towards them in order to reverse the state failure provides this. We say let the minorities do what they want, proud to oppose.
Thank you, DLO, for that speech, welcoming the government whip speaker.
All right, just give me a couple. Am I visible and audible?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Let me get my timer out. Wait, I think I lost a piece of paper. Okay, never mind. Okay. Speech begins in 3, 2, and 1. The crucial mistake that opposition makes from the very beginning of their case is that they fail to analyze how this humor is actually going to be interpreted, both by the individuals who are not part of the minority and the individuals who are part of the minority. It is crucial to understand how this humor is actually going to be taken to understand what the effect of the humor is. The most important actor in this debate is not the comedian and their own personal ends and their own personal catharsis and emotional luggage. The most important actor in this debate is society at large and what narratives we would propagate into that society. For that reason, I'm so proud to propose today, still as the third speaker. So what am I going to do for you in my speech? Firstly, I want to characterize very clearly how people are going to interpret this humor and why that's so important. And then I'm going to talk about the perception of crucial issues and as well as outreach. And then I'm going to do a lot of weighing throughout that. So to begin, how will people actually interpret this humor? And I want to flag here that this determines whether or not this humor is actually conducive to productive dialogue and social progress within minority communities and within society at large. What was our stance from the very beginning? It's that entertainers want to appeal to the masses in order to make money and get fame. These are their natural incentives. And this means that their self-deprecating humor will be received vastly by fans who are not from the same group as them. And then we give you two frames that are still uncontested. That firstly, people watch comedy movies and comedy specials with the expectation that the content is not going to be serious, that the content is not going to include political messaging, that the content is lighthearted and meant for laughs. But secondly, that in order to pick up on subtle seriousness of this humor, you need to have shared that experience and already understand how serious it is. Otherwise, you're going to assume that these things are trivial because of the lighthearted nature of humor. What does this mean then? It means that the audience that does not belong to the minority of the entertainer misunderstands the core issues because they misunderstand the humor in the first place. Now, that leads me to the first theme then, on the perception of issues. The claim that we have made from the beginning is that important issues facing minorities are trivialized and romanticized, which halts and even reverses progress within social movements by creating complacency. So, firstly, not right now. How is comedy misinterpreted? It is because comedy is supposed to be funny and lighthearted, and that is how people perceive comedy. That is how people prime themselves before listening to comedy. And this signals to the audience that whatever is spoken about in this, humorous media is promptly a lighthearted matter. People are prone to see it as this way, even if you don't believe that, because of confirmation bias. Because it takes away the moral fatigue by believing that the issues facing minorities are not that deep and that they're not that serious. That all of a sudden, you are alleviated from the responsibility you always feel on your shoulders by the fact that you are a privileged person and there are Black people suffering on the street, that there are Asian people suffering across the world. That is suddenly taken off your shoulders when you're constantly told by comedians that when you constantly see comedians joking about these issues, which signals to you that these are trivial matters, these are lighthearted matters, you are likely to interpret it that way because of confirmation bias. What this results then is less propensity to actually act against those issues and to actually solve them. It also leads to things like less voting for these issues, less advocacy, and less attention to it because it is something that is not on your mind as ardently anymore. But it also leads to things like victim blaming when minorities fail due to systemic oppression because they're constantly told that oppression isn't that bad implicitly through this humor and through that lightheartedness and through that trivialization of these issues. But also, secondly, we say that within this community, these issues are romanticized. And this is why. Because opposition says themselves that this comedy and this humor is a way to unify this minority and to provide a unification under shared struggles and experiences. What that then means is that your identity and your association with that minority is actually hinged on those experiences. And that is especially true considering that minorities are the most enfranchised and most successful members of that minority. So they are the exemplar, they are the role model for their community, and people want to be like them. They are the face of their minority, of their marginalized groups, and they define what is the Black experience, what is the Asian experience. And what this does is lead to two things. Firstly, it leads to pride about things like living in the hood or facing parental abuse, when really you should not feel proud about those things. Maybe you can feel proud about the struggle that you had facing them, but you shouldn't want to actually continue to experience living in the hood, which is a problem that is faced by the Black community through the propagation of things like rap music and comedy that romanticizes the experience of living in the hood. What you should be doing is acknowledging that this is a serious issue and that it needs to change and should actively be taking steps to make it out of the hood or to address the problem of abuse that you're facing with your parents and things like that. Not right now. But secondly, what this also will do is it's going to alienate members of your own community that do not share those same experiences. And they're suddenly going to feel alienation. They're suddenly going to feel imposter syndrome. They're going to wonder, how come I was never poor? Am I truly Black for not being poor? Oh, I was never good at math. Am I truly Asian for not being good at math? And all of those sorts of things. Now, I want to do some weighing here because opposition says to all of this that no, it is justified because this is a tool for comedians to communicate and express their experience. Firstly, they have other tools. And this is what we've told you from the beginning, that it is much better to use serious rhetoric towards these things that actually convey the severity of these issues. You are a comedian because you are funny and you have a platform because of that. but that does not mean that you need to use the skill you use to gain that platform in order to talk about other issues that are not appropriate in a comedic setting. As a comedian or as a funny entertainer, you can still talk about issues in a very serious manner. You don't always have to use comedy. You have to explain why comedy was the best tool to do that, and you cannot do that insofar as we explain all of these damages. So then you just have to you have to weigh the massive detriments of bad perceptions that we get from their side of the house against the comedian's right to their own personal catharsis, which is extremely trivial. I'll take that point.
If rap music and movies all face the same problem of not being able to be representative enough of the entirety of the community, then what representation do minorities truly have in pop culture?
I don't see why they need the representation in pop culture. But also, you can just get your representation by the fact of the matter that the person who is the comedian, the person who is the actor, the person who's the rapper is black or is Asian or is white or is whatever. You don't need them to talk about their experiences. You just need them to be up there. All right. Secondly, then on outreach, what we get from opposition is a claim that is very dubious. We get more outreach from minority entertainers because they gain a competitive advantage and a captive audience by speaking on their experiences. Firstly, what actually makes these people successful? Because I would say that minority entertainers are already successful and qualified because they are funny and they are talented. They already have a captive audience, furthermore, from their own minority groups because they are the same as their minority groups, as I've just outlined. But also, you can still talk about your experiences as a minority in a way that isn't self-deprecating. This looks like Gabriel Iglesias celebrating Mexican cuisine. Op needs to prove why this humor needs to be self-deprecating in order to gain that captive audience and get that increased outreach in the first place. They never do that they never do that, so they never prove that. But secondly, I want to talk about who this audience actually is. Because yes, some of their humor might be targeted towards the minorities, but entertainers cannot stop people from without the same experiences from watching their content. And Op says themselves, comedians will tell jokes about everything, and self-deprecating humor is a tool. This means that there's going to have diverse audiences, many of whom are going to misunderstand their humor. And even if this is once true, the alternative is that comedians have audiences of largely their own minority. And that means that to that extent, their platform means nothing because they need to gain attention from outsiders in order for actual change to occur within these social issues. And then lastly, on misrepresentation and generalization. This got the least amount of clash, so I'm spending the least amount of time. It is simply true that it is principally wrong to generalize groups, even if it is your own experience. It is principally wrong to alienate people of your own members when you have an obligation to them as the most franchised member of them. This leads to things like bullying. This leads to things like exacerbated stereotypes. For those reasons, I'm so proud.
Thank you, Gov, for that speech, welcoming opposition whip speaker.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, cool. I'll take POIs in the chat, preferably after the 5th minute. Thank you. And also after the 5th minute, if I don't think they just verbalize it. It's all good. I'll be going in 3, 2, 1. Proposition stood to remove the experiences and memories which cultivated the entire concept of comedy, effectively locking out minorities due to the stark comparison of experience they had with other people from the majority. If it was their burden to kill satire, they completely fulfill it. But if it was to enhance the life of minority comedians, if it was to enhance comedy and help people on the ground, they do the exact opposite. So proud to oppose. I have a few observations of my speech. Firstly, about how comedy on their side changes and why does their response to the POI dismember the proposition case. A, how you need to conform towards majoritarian experiences and how minorities are funny regardless. We think this was their major response towards the entirety of our case. But the entire problem about this response was that the majoritarian experience wasn't persuasive enough to make you outweigh over the other majoritarian actors that are out there who also do comedy. So they never answered the question about how are these people going to be able to stand out in the first place. They said that this debate wasn't about comedy, but literally recognize the fact that the people who we're talking about are minority comedians, and these are the people who have always used this sort of experience to be able to outshine those who come from the majoritarian experience. They needed to answer this, but it's far too late. Secondly, about how it confines comedy towards the mundane similarities of life. This dilutes the comedic effect and the entertainment effect it has. We agree with them that they can be funny regardless of other things, but it's about the fact that what makes it so persuasive and what makes them so interesting in the first place is the fact that they have some sort of very deep connection with their communities and that they have some sort of relatability in the first place. So when I laugh at someone who's making jokes about how they had to study a lot in India, I also understand that because I'm from that nation and I'm able to relate to it to some extent. But finally, their alternative are about how cute cat videos and Donald Trump can be something individuals do. However, this still happens on our side of the house. We have people like Cat Williams, a minority comedian, talking about how he was attacked by Hollywood and calling them out in a jokingly way. But that still didn't change the fact that the joke existed out of their own minority representation, and it did have some political posturing. So he was still able to make a joke outside of the usual self-deprecating experience, but it was also able to call people out. We were able to co-op a lot of their benefits. But finally, the glaring contradictions in their case, we have two major ones here. Firstly, about how people don't want to listen to comedy and entertainment for political messaging. But then they literally posit so many harms about people trying to rationalize stereotypes and about how these jokes embed themselves into the consciousness of individuals. This takes a majority of their case out because they race to the bottom. The fact that people feel segregated from their communities. All of these problems are further removed from their side of the house insofar as people don't want to take it as a political message and they just want it for comedy and entertainment. But even if we take both sides, we still win on it because we're still able to have political messaging. We're still able to have people enjoy it. But the other contradiction was that you don't need representation. You just need them to talk about the experience, and you don't need them to talk about the experience. You just need an Asian or a Black artist to be there. Like, the levels of convenience coming in from this side is ridiculous. You will obviously need some people to be there because the real way that representation occurs is when people talk about these issues that exist. That's the way political spotlights occur, and that's the way awareness spreads. They can't be this convenient, and they already lose this because of the two major contradictions taking the entirety of the case out. Finally, on the lack of visualization from their side of the house. Firstly, about how individuals misunderstand what these jokes mean coming in from their side. We told you that jokes are abstract, meaning that individuals do get the main intention or the main message of these jokes. If they're really extreme jokes, we have safeguards against them. Call-out culture, and the fact that these people have managers who control what they say are the sort of people who will call them out if they go beyond the bounds. But not only that, is that these jokes taking their own framing, if people are coming in for entertainment, will not be something that's not going to be misunderstood. But even if it is, there is no realistic world impact. But finally, about political messaging, we explained that comedy is a medium which helps you do it, that you package a certain message in a certain way. So when I talk about my experiences in a joking way, it's also about the fact that it's shedding light on a situation which genuinely did harm me. People are able to see through the lines, and the people who are from these communities, and even if they're not, can see the harms that it genuinely did towards the people who are standing on the platform. But finally, about how the platform is worth and about that they won't understand. The answer here is simple. I'll take you in a bit. Sorry? Okay, I won't take it later. I'll take it later. The delta is that you don't have anyone on their side of the house who relates to this experience. We explained about how mundane experiences aren't something that's generally beneficial in the first place. The comparative on their best case scenario, on our side of the house, you still have a portion of people who are able to relate to the experiences, meaning that you're still able to retain a sort of audience. On their side of the house, they still have to explain about why these people will have an audience, even though they're way more privileged actors in the first place. Moving on to rebuttals. Two major problems here. Firstly, about how the progression of society is hindered by comedy. They had a major case shift where they just completely dropped this point, but let's still address it. Recognize the progression of society has still occurred under our side of the house. Our side reflects status quo, and individuals, even if they make these self-depreciating jokes, we still have marches for protest, women still gaining freedom to do more actions, and minority representation at an all-time high, meaning that we're able to do this. But finally, I'll talk about how it improves further on our side of the house, winning them on their own metric. But finally, about how these jokes delegitimize the harms that exist within the real world. Yes, because suddenly the people will not see the news about how their kid got shot for being gay and about how these people were being massacred for being part of a different ethnicity. I think people still see real world examples of how how society is really messed up and about what problems do exist. They can't co-opt this and say and sugarcoat the entirety of the case. But then they say victim blaming occurs, and on a scale it gets on a scale it gets higher. But they never actually prove about why victim blaming still doesn't occur on their side of the house. There will obviously be other avenues. They need to explain why it was such a weighted comparison that this was a main thing that created victim blaming culture. Insofar as they don't answer that, they can't claim any of the benefits. But finally, how the entire perception of this comedy is not reducing the harms that individuals face by laughing, but it's also about the fact that so many people face similar experiences and about how bad it was for them, that you have Dave Chappelle talking about the fact that the happiest moments he had was when his friend's mom cooked him a really good meal. However, proposition posits that they're proud of these injustices for some reason. No one in comedy is meaning to use this experiences of being of having a terrible life as a proud experience. They're rather shedding a spotlight on the problems that exist. But finally, onto the first Flash. I'll take you right now. Yeah.
You keep saying that people will be able to read between the lines for this humor, but this is a debate. Please mechanize that instead of asserting it.
All right, I'll do it later. firstly about how minority comedians have the moral right to make these certain jokes. We told you that everyone, that even if these are stereotypical in nature, they do genuinely represent the harms that these people face when they were living through these conditions. So this is entertainment, meaning that individuals should not be confined to a certain type of comedy. We don't support extremes, and we already have safeguards, meaning that people can still enjoy this. But finally, it's about the fact that they gain dignity and respect through the experiences on a consumer and comedian basis. On to comedians. Comedians have escapism, understanding the fact that people do go through the same amounts of pain as them, and about how entertainment is not a black and white medium. So this means that individuals are still able to read through the lines for the exact reason that the jokes are showing what struggles they had, and that they're able to show some sort of representation in the fact that I do have some sort of similar experience as you. People read through the lines because they had some sort of similarities to them. Even if they were from the majoritarian party, they have some sort of other avenues to use this comedy, which helps them as a portal to access other information, meaning that comedy acts as a stepping stone towards gaining this. But consumers also have escapism on our side. They have a sense of community because they're able to feel as though someone relates to me, but finally they also have aspirations. On to their other point about how individuals who didn't have experiences are locked out. They never explained why individuals who are likely to not face these problems are likely to be people who are wealthy immigrants or successful minority groups who never grew up in these places. So they need to explain why individuals who are so detached from these communities in the first place are suddenly the ones feeling hurt because they weren't included in this. They needed to explain this. But the real world harm in this debate is that not about your experience deviating from what Hasan Minhaj experienced, but you looking at comedy with no black and Asian artists in it because they have no way to stand out against the other people. But finally, we told you about political spotlighting was also better on our side. We told you that comedy helps highlight personal experiences, but you widen the audience because it's under an umbrella of pop culture. So I might be I might be a black woman, but that also means that the BLM and the BLM movement and all of these other experiences can have some sort of interconnectiveness. Also, finally, there's no race to the bottom for the exact reason that people understand their different contexts. So I can't compare my trauma to someone else's. It's rather that they all try and help each other. We're able to win this debate on the massive scale. We take this round. Thank you.
Thank you all for that speech. Welcoming opposition reply speaker.
Okay. Per opposition's own rhetoric, rap music, which provided solace for all of the Black individuals out there who related to the experience of living in a high crime rate society and a society where gang culture was quite prominent and haunted their lives, was unrepresentative, and it was unjustified because it would never truly experience everyone in the community. But I think that the false comparative that they are running on today is not good representation versus self-deprecating representation, but no representation versus self-deprecating representation then. Because they never told you why mocking cat videos would be fully representative of the minority experience then. Petrie directly concedes to this when they tell you, to the response to my POI, that we don't need representation in pop culture. What does this mean? This means that you're locking out these minorities from the majority, that these people watch movies, that these people listen to music, that these people watch comedies to begin with. I think this debate then clashes in terms of two actors. One, in terms of the entertainers out there were no engagement coming from proposition other than telling you that they should homogenize the experiences of these minorities to the average Joe's life, and they are able to fully express themselves then. Because they tell you that their experiences were never legitimate enough to be part of your community. They tell the Asian comedian that was good in mathematics but wanted to go to music school, and the Asian kid that wasn't good in math cannot talk about this because even if they wanted to talk about it in a way that they were passionate about through humor, because it was never fully representative. Their harms on generalization was already taken out when we've told you throughout all three speakers that it's uniquely through pop culture with huge consumer bases, with different niches, and that was palatable to all sorts of experiences, that everyone in the group can talk about it regardless of what your experience was, because comedy prioritizes personal experience. It is then when you allow individuals to have more optics into what the lives of minorities actually look like then, through the different nuances of the pieces of the individuals within the community. Then, it was correct for Petrie to recognize that there are a lot of platforms in which you can fight for representation. Therefore, it is important then here that pop culture should be reserved for the entertainers who have very much been through the experiences that made them into who they are today, that very much have been bullied and have been sad about all of their experiences then and now chooses to use humor as a way of escapism. Then, they never dealt with this throughout all three speakers. But second, in terms of minority consumers and majority consumers, because their biggest harm here was in terms of the optics in which these consumers will perceive you. I believe that a lot of people do relate to these experiences, so this is why it is so popular within minority communities as well. But in order for you to talk about your experiences as a minority, under the comments, when Kevin Hart talks about his experiences in a high crime rate community and it goes viral because people relate to it, this is probably the best avenue in which you're able to talk about it compared to a Mexican comedian eating Mexican food on his show. They probably won't gain any virality at all. You chase away these individuals from the platform that they deserve. But in terms of the majority consumers then, I believe that we treat all of the consumers to be rational actors to begin with, but there are also structures like social media and cancel culture which holds them accountable to begin with. This means that even if kids that watches these comedies believe that they use these jokes against their minority classmates, it probably means that when these minorities are able to talk about their experiences on social media, they're able to gain much more support and much more solace than compared to a world where people continue to be racist to them, but they have no platform, no representation, and no empowerment when you don't see someone relating to their experiences when it comes to comedy and pop culture. Proud to oppose.
Thank you, opposition reply, for that speech. Welcoming the government reply speaker.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, thank you. 3 questions in today's debate. Firstly, what is our comparative? Secondly, which side better represents minorities? And thirdly, how will comedians affect discourse? Firstly, what is our comparative? Unfortunately for side opposition, they must have mistakenly read the motion, because throughout their entire op block, their only case line was, oh, we need to share minority experiences, without recognizing the contingency in the info slide. That is to say that this sort of minority experience the opposition supported needed to be self-deprecating. Why was that incredibly important and a path to victory for side proposition? Which audience is most likely? If you're a minority, would you watch a comedian that constantly deprecates their own identity? Of course not. The audience for these comedians are not minorities because these comedians don't actually represent these minorities. What was the better, more likely comparative that side proposition kept on telling you? We told you that the actual audience are rich, racist, white men who have a lot of spending power, who have a lot of numbers. That is the true comparative on their side of the house. These comedians are not appealing to minorities whom they don't represent. I think these comedians have a direct profit incentive to appeal to the most powerful individuals in this debate, and ultimately that falls on the side of side proposition. So what is our comparative? Our comparative is to talk about minority experiences that don't necessarily involve things like self-deprecation. So I think the audiences on our side are significantly much more likely going to be minority-based because we're not actively attacking, minority groups, right? I think on our side, that's where minorities actually feel proud of themselves. So I think on likelihood, the world that side proposition gives to you is significantly more likely than the unrealistic one we saw from opposition. All right, but even in their best case, I still want to explain why minorities are likely going to be misrepresented. Not only do they have the incentive to appeal to stereotypes, there's toxic competition, which they still haven't dealt with, but thirdly, there's perverse profit incentives. What gets the most reaction? Not what's the most authentic, but the people in positions of power, the white CEOs. So ultimately, how do we weigh this out? Firstly, the worst situations are in highly conservative countries where comedians often don't have control over their own program, and often those in power are dominated by white men. Insofar as that world falls on our side of the house, I think we win on vulnerability insofar as we solve those issues in those cases specifically. But secondly, their narrative of safe spaces relies on a certain contingency. It necessitates that minorities must self-deprecate themselves in order to access those safe spaces in the first place. On our side, when comedians portray minorities in a positive way, there are no contingencies. So on weighing, we're winning on universality because in order for minorities to ever access any sort of safe space, they had to make a self-deprecating joke about themselves on their side of the house. Opposition makes minorities feel like they don't live up to these stereotypes. Massive harm on their side. All right, on to how comedians affect discourse. So they basically told us that like people are like going to be more engaged, which means like they'll do more research about like the issue and like talk about these issues. But as I pointed out in a POI, even if people are more engaged with their political messaging is terrible. They're literally telling people that minorities are somehow worse and must self-deprecate themselves. But as Irfan points to in third, comedians can't control how their act is interpreted. Given that audiences are likely only there for a laugh, their interpretation is likely going to be incredibly surface level. They won't be interested in the so-called deeper message that side opposition keeps on telling us about. Instead, the more likely scenario is what we give you. That's the fact that this issue is likely going to be incredibly trivialized, that this is going to be joked about. And the weighing here is that insofar as on our side, long-term tangible policy change is far more likely because people actually recognize these issues like discrimination as real serious issues. I think this is also a round-winning deadlock breaker on our side of the house. Ultimately, the minority experience is not a joke. Side opposition never understood that. We're incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you, Speaker, for that speech. And with that, we've come to the end of this amazing debate. Welcoming everyone to cross floor, shake hands, and the judges will go to the judge room for deliberation.
Thank you for the debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good round, everyone.